Like, share, comment, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to our channel for more real and true stories like this. I never expected to feel this way about anyone at work. When I first joined the company, Mr. Langston was just my boss. Friendly but professional, always with a warm smile but never too familiar. And I was just fine with that. I loved my husband, and our lives were comfortable and stable, built on years of shared routines and quiet companionship. But as time went on, something about Mr. Langston started to feel different. Or maybe it was me that felt different around him. It started small, almost insignificant. A lingering smile in the break room, a compliment about a project I'd led, or his glance that would hold mine just a little longer than I was used to. I brushed it off at first, told myself I was imagining things. After all, he was my boss. But that feeling, the one that made me want to see him just one more time each day, crept up on me in ways I hadn't expected. One Friday, we were the last ones in the office finishing up a big project. The entire team had left, and as I packed up, he wandered over to my desk with a tired smile and an offer for a quick drink to celebrate. I hesitated, the part of me that knew better almost saying no, but he looked so relaxed, not like my boss, but more like an equal, someone who had been through the same late nights and tight deadlines as I had. Before I could second guess it, I said yes. We ended up at a quiet bar nearby where he ordered us drinks, and we talked about everything but work. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed so freely, the way he leaned in to listen to my stories, his eyes crinkling at the edges in a way that felt too familiar. I kept telling myself to wrap it up, to call it a night and go home. But every time I thought about leaving, he'd start a new conversation, keeping me there a little longer, and I didn't mind. It was close to midnight when I finally glanced at my watch, realizing how late it had gotten. I apologized, starting to gather my things, but he reached out, gently placing his hand over mine. His touch was warm, and for a split second I didn't move. It was just a touch, something small and innocent, but it felt like an invitation, one I hadn't realized I'd wanted until that moment. "You don't have to leave just yet," he said softly, his eyes searching mine, as if he was waiting for me to give him permission. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath catching in a way I couldn't control, but I pulled my hand back, offering a small smile, trying to act like it hadn't affected me the way it had. "I really should get going," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he stood up, reaching for his coat. We left together, the quiet between us charged with everything we hadn't said. As we walked to our cars, he looked over at me, giving me one last lingering smile. "We should do this again sometime," he said, his voice warm, inviting. And even though I knew it was risky, even though I told myself I shouldn't, I found myself nodding, feeling that spark flicker to life all over again. The weekend passed in a blur of chores and family dinners, but no matter what I was doing, Mr. Langston kept drifting into my thoughts. I caught myself daydreaming while folding laundry, my mind wandering back to that evening in the bar, the warmth of his hand over mine, the way his gaze softened, the way I'd felt. It was a strange pull, one that felt both exciting and dangerous. I shook it off again and again, but the memory clung to me. By Monday morning, I told myself I'd put it behind me. It was just one night, a simple moment between colleagues, and I wasn't going to read anything more into it. But the minute I walked into the office and saw him, I realized it wasn't that simple. He smiled as I passed his office, and I could feel the warmth in his gaze, a reminder of everything I'd tried to ignore. I gave a polite nod and hurried to my desk, heart racing as if I were doing something wrong. Throughout the morning, we exchanged emails about work, always professional, always appropriate. But each message felt like a private conversation. I found myself rereading his words, looking for any hint of the warmth I'd seen in him on Friday. I kept telling myself it was ridiculous, but by the time lunch rolled around, I hadn't been able to focus on anything but him. Later that day, he stopped by my desk, casually leaning over the edge to ask if I'd had a chance to look over a report. His closeness felt too intimate, his voice softer than it needed to be. I looked up, trying to keep my expression neutral, but I felt my cheeks flush. He noticed, his lips curving in a slight smile, and I quickly looked back down at my computer screen, willing myself to stay calm. "Are you free to discuss it in my office?" he asked, his voice light but somehow charged. I nodded, gathering my things and trying to ignore the flutter in my stomach. Inside his office, he closed the door behind us, though he'd never done that before, not unless it was a serious matter. I felt the walls close in and every nerve in my body was alert, waiting. He gestured for me to sit, settling across from me, and then started talking about the report. But I found it hard to concentrate. His words blurred, his voice lulling me into a strange, almost hypnotic state. Halfway through the conversation, he paused, studying me for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "You seem a little distracted." I could have brushed it off, laughed, or given some excuse, but instead, I met his gaze. There was something unspoken between us, something I couldn't deny any longer. I felt the tension building, my heart racing as I wondered if he felt it too, if he was as affected by our closeness as I was. "Yes," I replied softly, the word barely leaving my lips. His eyes held mine, and I could see something there, a flicker of doubt mixed with desire. The air between us felt heavy, charged, as if we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't turn back from. Before I could process what was happening, he reached across the desk, his fingers grazing mine. Just for a second. I should have pulled away. I should have ended it right then, but I didn't. His touch sent a shiver through me, a warmth that spread, lingering long after he withdrew his hand. We sat in silence, both aware of the boundary we'd almost crossed, both too hesitant to address it. He broke the silence first. "I'm sorry," he murmured, looking down, his voice filled with a vulnerability I hadn't expected. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I swallowed, my voice barely audible. "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. It was complicated, messy, and it stirred emotions I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt both drawn to him and pulled back by my sense of loyalty, by the quiet guilt that whispered in the back of my mind. Our workday continued as if nothing had happened, both of us going through the motions, exchanging polite nods and business-like emails. But every time I glanced his way, I felt that familiar tug, that need to be close to him again. By the time I packed up for the day, I was exhausted, both from the tension and from my own internal battle. Just as I was heading out, I saw him standing by the elevator, waiting. I hesitated, debating whether to take the stairs instead, to avoid the closeness of the small space. But as if sensing my hesitation, he looked back, his gaze inviting me to join him. As the elevator doors closed, the silence between us felt thick. I could feel his presence beside me, and every inch of me was aware of the space between us. Neither of us spoke, but as the elevator descended, I felt his hand brush mine, a touch so brief it could have been accidental, but the warmth of it lingered, a silent acknowledgement of everything unspoken between us. When the doors opened, he stepped out first, pausing to glance back at me, his eyes soft, conflicted. "Have a good night," he said, his voice a little rough. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. my mind reeling from everything that had almost happened. I watched him walk away, feeling the weight of all the things we hadn't said, all the boundaries we'd nearly crossed. And as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that whatever had started between us wasn't something I could ignore anymore. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. Every time I saw Mr. Langston, every stolen glance, every brush of hands felt charged with something I couldn't deny. I told myself to ignore it, to put distance between us, but it felt impossible. Somehow he seemed to be everywhere, in meetings, by the coffee machine, in quiet hallways where we'd pass each other, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that left me breathless. One evening, as I prepared to leave, I saw him in his office, leaning back in his chair, eyes closed, as if he were lost in thought. I hesitated, almost slipping out unnoticed, but something made me linger. He opened his eyes, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other, the quiet between us stretching thin. "I could use a second opinion on something," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant, as if testing whether I'd agree. I knew what I should say, knew I should just leave, but I didn't. Nodding, I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. It was a small decision, but one that felt monumental. I could feel my heart racing, every sense heightened by the knowledge that we were alone. He gestured for me to sit beside him, not across from him as usual. I took the seat, feeling the warmth radiating from him, the quiet closeness between us making it hard to breathe. We reviewed a presentation for the upcoming meeting, our conversation focused but softer than usual, each of us hyper-aware of the other's presence. At one point, our hands brushed again, and this time neither of us pulled away. His hand rested over mine, warm and steady, grounding me, and yet making me feel as though I was floating. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment everything else faded. The office, the meeting, even the world outside. He spoke first, his voice barely a whisper. "This is difficult for me," he said, his tone filled with the same longing and restraint I felt. "I don't want to complicate things for either of us, but I can't pretend I don't feel something here." Hearing him say it out loud made it all feel real, undeniable. I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. "Me neither." I knew I should say more, explain that this couldn't go any further, but words failed me. For a long moment, we just sat there, the silence between us filled with everything we couldn't say. I thought about my life, my husband, all the years we'd spent together, and the quiet steadiness of our relationship. This was nothing like that. It was intense, fleeting, and uncertain, and yet it felt just as real. He squeezed my hand gently, his gaze soft, and for a moment, I thought he might lean in, that I might let him. But then, as if we'd both silently agreed, he pulled back, letting out a deep breath as he looked down, visibly gathering himself. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the words thick with regret. "This isn't fair to you." I nodded, feeling the same regret, the same sense of loss for something that had never really happened. Maybe it's for the best," I whispered, even though every part of me wanted to believe otherwise. We shared one last look, a silent promise to let this go, to walk away before it became something we couldn't take back. That night, as I drove home, I felt a bittersweet ache, a mixture of relief and sadness. I knew we'd made the right decision, knew that what we had was something fleeting, born of proximity and timing, and the need for connection. But a part of me still wondered what might have happened if we'd let ourselves go just a little further, if we'd crossed that line. The next day, when I saw him in the office, he greeted me with the same warm, professional smile he'd always had. as if nothing had changed, and I smiled back, grateful for the unspoken understanding we now shared, a memory to hold, a boundary we respected, and a choice that, despite the longing, we hadn't regretted. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to our channel for more real and true stories like this.